Today marks the launch of the RTX 5070, Nvidia's most affordable 5000 series GPU to date at $550. But rather than focusing on the performance of this card in a brand new PC, kitted out with a Ryzen 9800X 3D, we're instead going to take a look at a couple older CPU platforms to see if you should consider upgrading to a new GPU in the first place. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff, and today we're going to get right into it. The RTX 5070 is Nvidia's latest Blackwell graphics card and is launching today for $549. Now, unfortunately, I don't have review samples of AMD's RX 9070 or 9070 XT GPUs, which should be launching tomorrow for $549 and $599 respectively. So rather than answering the question of which GPU is the best at sub-$600 price points, which my guess is going to be the 9070 XT, I'm instead going to look at the RTX 5070 on a couple older platforms to see if any of these mid-range GPUs would be viable upgrade options if you're looking to extend the life of your existing PC. Like most other reviewers, today I am going to be giving some performance numbers from the RTX 5070 when paired with the Ryzen 9 9800X 3D, the undisputed king of gaming CPUs as of the time of filming. It's a great measuring stick for GPUs as it eliminates a great deal of CPU bottlenecks and allows us to compare the GPUs on a level playing field. I've mentioned before, but I'd recommend checking out eTechnics if you're looking for a top-to-bottom comparison to see exactly where the RTX 5070 lands when compared to other GPUs. That level playing field is great information when you're building a new PC, but what if you're looking to upgrade a PC that you already have? I mean, you don't want to buy a new graphics card and then have its performance strangled by your aging CPU. Compared to a brand new, top-of-the-line 9800X 3D, how does a 3-year-old CPU compare? How about a 6-year-old CPU? And how bad is the potential performance drop-off? To test this out, I've got not only the Ryzen 9800X 3D, but also an Intel Core i7-12700K and a Ryzen 7 3700X. The 12700K first debuted in November of 2021 for a retail price of $409, and was a solid mid-range option at nearly $200 less than the 12900K flagship. It's a hybrid big little CPU with 8 performance cores, 4 efficiency cores, and a total of 20 threads. Going back even further, the Ryzen 7 3700X came out all the way back in November of 2019, nearly 5.5 years ago. It's an 8-core CPU with 16 threads and had a retail price of just $330 at launch. If you're looking to only upgrade your graphics card, you might not want to spend the $479 price tag on a Ryzen 9 9800X 3D, let alone the AM5 motherboard and potentially DDR5 memory you will also need to support it. But if we're trying to answer the question, should you upgrade your graphics card, we need a point of reference for what graphics card you're upgrading from. Nvidia's 3000 series GPUs launched in late 2020 and were quite common to pair with either of these CPUs. But listening to reviews at the time for the flagship RTX 3090, you might be led to believe that anything short of Intel's CPU flagship in the 12900K would bottleneck its performance and result in you wasting your money on such an expensive graphics card, unless you had the absolute bleeding-edge CPU to go with it. A much more common GPU to pair with either of these chips would have been something like the RTX 3070, as it better matched the mid-range performance and budget expectations for computers like this. But fast forward nearly half a decade, and your RTX 3070 isn't feeling quite as spry as it once did. And as luck would have it, there's also been 3 brand new GPUs that have just been announced for under $600. But remember what I just said about GPUs as fast as the RTX 3090 being way too fast for anything but flagship tier CPUs. Well, you don't have one of those, and spoiler alert, the RTX 5070 is also around 5 to 10% faster than the RTX 3090 was. If you do upgrade your GPU, what kind of performance hit are you going to be seeing versus just building or buying a brand new PC? Before we get any further into the video, why don't you put your guesses down in the comments below? Today we're running my standard suite of games, all at 1440p and ultra settings. Cyberpunk 2077, Doom Eternal, Dragon Age Veilguard, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, Metro Exodus, Starfield, and Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Will the RTX 5070 be bottlenecked by a Ryzen 3700X versus a Ryzen 9800X 3D? And if so, by how much? Chime in down below. With that, let's see how the RTX 5070 stacks up against the rest of the cards that I've tested in the last month. Though again, keep in mind, I don't yet have numbers for AMD's 9070 cards, so I won't be giving any recommendations based on price or value here. First up, the results that should shock absolutely no one. The RTX 5070 is around 25 to 30% slower than the RTX 5070 Ti, while costing around 27% less at MSRP. As far as price to performance, it's basically bang on with where it should be, in line with the rest of the 5000 series. Today, there's going to be a lot of unhappy reviewers when comparing to the last generation. The RTX 5070 is only around 15% faster than the RTX 4070 that it replaces, making it basically tied with the RTX 4070 Super. For those looking for single-generation performance uplifts, prepare for more disappointment, as the 5000 series just isn't that much of a bump over the 4000 series. But those are the results for a brand new build with a brand new Ryzen 9800X 3D. What about an Intel 12700K or a Ryzen 3700X? How much of a drop-off is there going to be when running a CPU that's 3 or 4 generations behind the times? Like I said, I also wanted a GPU to compare against, so I ran my full benchmark suite on the RTX 3070 on both CPUs as well. Now, of note, the majority of my current game suite does tend to be GPU limited, and I chose those games for testing graphics cards, but running on a CPU with 40% less single-threaded performance should still make a massive difference, right? In synthetic tests, the RTX 5070 is around 60% faster than the RTX 3070, as tested on the Ryzen 9800X 3D. And while that doesn't always translate into real-world gaming results, it usually does provide at least a starting point for comparison, which is exactly why we run them. Also, all the numbers that I'll be talking about during this video are between the 3700X and the 9800X 3D, but I did include the results from the 12700K in all of my charts. Results between the 12700K and the 3700X were similar enough to just ignore the middle child. Starting things off with Doom Eternal, the RTX 3070 manages 231 frames per second on the Ryzen 3700X with a 1% low of 112. A solid performance overall, and not really in need of an upgrade if all you want to play is Doom Eternal. But dropping the RTX 5070 into the PC sees performance jump by only around 42%, coming in with 327 FPS on average. Low frame rates also only saw around a 15% improvement as well, meaning there may be a CPU limitation holding us back in this title. On the 9800X 3D, our average does improve with the 5070, but only by around 7%, up to 351 FPS. But, just as I suspected, those low frame rates shot up by 35% by switching to the newer CPU. Now, this isn't particularly noteworthy, as we were already seeing a 0.1% low of 109, so jumping up to 168 FPS is a difference of just 4.2 milliseconds in the slowest 0.1% of frames generated. But maybe other games will be a bit more dramatic. Cyberpunk 2077 is definitely going to go down as this generation's crisis, with its off-the-chart system requirements, and that's not just when it comes to the GPU performance. Here, the RTX 3070 is able to hit 67 FPS on average at 1440p and ultra settings, but only when ray tracing is disabled. Upgrading to the RTX 5070 shows the CPU is still a weak point for this particular title, with performance only improving by around 20% overall, averaging 80 FPS. Jumping over to the 9800X 3D, performance jumps by a full 75%, hitting 140 FPS on average, with lows also improving by around 40%. When people hear about CPU bottlenecks on graphics cards, these are the kinds of results they're referring to. But as you'll see throughout the rest of this video, it's not nearly as simple as better CPU equals better performance. Kingdom Come: Deliverance was one of my favorite games when it came out in 2018, and I've been jazzed to see more people get on board with the series now that the sequel has come out. In Kingdom Come 2, the RTX 3070 does start to show its age a bit, with it not able to hit 60 frames per second on average at 1440p and ultra settings. To be fair though, it does tend to be a slower paced game, and is still mostly playable even with frame dips down towards 25 FPS. A couple settings tweaks, and we could probably get both numbers to climb up by quite a bit. A new graphics card does go a long way in helping the average frame rate, with the RTX 5070 hitting 81 frames per second on average. The really interesting thing though is when we move to the 9800X 3D, as the average frame rate barely moves, improving by just 8%. But the 0.1% low more than doubles, completely eliminating stuttering or frame drops with a very impressive 65 FPS. I'd be very curious to spend a little bit more time testing different settings in this game to see if we could bring those lows up on the 3700X to make the frame rate more consistent. But if you're wanting to play at max settings, a new CPU is definitely something to consider. Another title that's been insanely difficult to run even with modern hardware is Starfield, though it also doesn't seem to have the lasting appeal as other Bethesda RPGs. But it's fun to benchmark and graphically intensive, so it stays on the list for now. Results on this title are remarkably similar to Kingdom Come 2, both in averages, lows, and differences between cards and platforms. The RTX 3070 manages an average of just 56 frames per second at 1440p and ultra settings, while the RTX 5070 sees a 44% improvement up to 81 FPS. Low frame rates for both cards are still in the low 20s, with a significant amount of stuttering present. While not quite as dramatic as Kingdom Come, the RTX 5070, when paired with a 9800X3D, does significantly shore up the lows, hitting 41 FPS for a 73% improvement. This is one title I was a bit disappointed with, as the action on screen is quite a bit faster paced than it is with Kingdom Come, so I opted to enable DLSS balanced mode. While that dramatically improved the average frame rates of every GPU, the lows stayed virtually the same, serving to more enhance the stuttering rather than solve it. I am curious to try out Nvidia's new DLSS transform model, and also see which settings in-game seem to be holding the system back as a whole, as I don't think it's down to just the graphics card at this point. But that's a bit outside the scope of today's video, and will either wait for another day, or be forgotten about entirely. Metro Exodus was one of the first games to integrate RTX global illumination all the way back in 2018. In fact, I remember getting a hands-on demo at PAX West of that year, the first time RTX was being demoed in the US after Nvidia's GDC announcement. Man, time flies. Here in 2025, it's still a great game and definitely well worth a playthrough. But it's also easy to see why ray tracing wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms by the gaming community in 2018, as the RTX 3070 can't even manage 60 frames per second with RTX enabled. The lows are pretty harsh too at just 24 FPS. Much like Starfield, it's not exactly great for a single-player shooter that requires pinpoint accuracy against fast-moving targets. The RTX 5070 on the Ryzen 3700X does improve numbers across the board, with averages climbing by around 56% and low frame rates getting a sizable bump, though again 31 FPS still feels a bit jittery on the bottom end of things. This right here is a title where DLSS absolutely comes to the rescue, with the RTX 3070 climbing all the way up to 91 frames per second on average with a low of 34, and the RTX 5070 improving even further, managing 125 FPS on average and a low of 42. While moving to the Ryzen 9800X3D does make a difference, it's only by around 13% on average, showing that whatever performance threshold is holding us back in this game, it's likely on the graphics side of things, not down to the CPU. If you're looking for a fun hack-and-slash style game, I've been having a lot of fun with Dragon Age Veilguard, so long as you don't mind EA's game-as-a-service even though you paid full price style game. Here's another title where the RTX 3070 starts to go a bit senile with its age, with an average of just 34 frames per second and a low of 7. Ouch. The reason? This is the only title in my testing that exceeded 8 GB of video memory used in the game. Well, almost. Cyberpunk with path tracing at 1440p did require around 9.5 GB, and Kingdom Come 2 did hit 9 GB on occasion, but neither seemed to impact the performance of the RTX 3070 that much. But with Veilguard, nearly 11 GB of use just feels bloated. On the Ryzen 3700X, the RTX 5070 improves performance by a full 85%, exceeding all expectations and making the game more than playable at 62 frames per second on average with a low of 37. As for the Ryzen 9800X3D, we see almost no difference at all, hitting just 65 FPS on average and a low of 42. Measurable? Yes. Noticeable? No. And again, this is absolutely a title I'd recommend getting over whatever notion is stopping you from using DLSS, because it is good and I would just enable it. 81 FPS on average with a low of 51 is a noticeable improvement over 63 and 37 FPS respectively. And last, but certainly not least, we come to the real Dark Souls of ray tracing, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. To answer the short question, the Ryzen 9800X3D made virtually no difference to performance over the 3700X. The game is all about GPU horsepower if you want actual results. As for the should you upgrade your RTX 3070 if you want to play this game question, yes. Yes, you should. At 1080p and low settings, Indiana Jones requires over 7 GB of memory. The game won't even launch at 1440p and immediately crashes with any other detail setting. Now, at 1080p and low settings, we're talking about 172 frames per second on average, so certainly playable if you're fine with Steam Deck levels of detail. But what shocked me was that the RTX 5070 had issues with memory limits as well. I don't think only having 12 gigabytes of memory is a reason not to buy this GPU, but I couldn't enable RTX with full path tracing to compare performance against the 5090 and the 5080. 1440p is just too much to handle with any substantial RTX effects enabled. At supreme settings and RTX low, the game is still beautiful and incredibly smooth at 133 frames per second, but is likely the only title you'll come across outside of Microsoft Flight Sim or City Skylines where VRAM limitations prevent you from cranking graphics to the max and expecting it to just run. So, that's a lot of games and a lot of numbers, but what do they all mean in the end? If you have an aging system and you're wanting to get some fresh life out of it, should you consider a mid-range GPU in the near future? Comparing directly to the RTX 3070, when paired with the Ryzen 3700X, we saw a 50% improvement in frame rates on average, with improvements in the low frames closer to 25%. Let me just turn to my left and give you the real numbers here. That means in Cyberpunk with RTX Overdrive and DLSS enabled, we went from 34 FPS to 55 FPS. We went from 33.6 to 62 FPS in Dragon Age Veilguard. We went from 56 FPS to 81 FPS in Starfield. Those are the kind of differences that take a game from the fringes of playability to actually an enjoyable experience, which is why we all play games, right? And keep in mind, that's at 1440p and ultra settings, which means you've got some options to speed things up, and not all of them require buying a new GPU. On the RTX 3070, you could drop down to high or even medium settings in newer games, and I'm betting this card will still slice through them like butter. I'm actually going to be doing a whole video on older common GPUs like the RTX 3060 or the Radeon RX 5700 and see how they stack up in modern games. So make sure you're subscribed if you're trying to squeeze some new life out of your old hardware. An improvement of 50% between the RTX 3070 and the RTX 5070 is also just barely behind the 62% improvement we saw in synthetic testing on the 9800X 3D, meaning we're actually not losing that much performance at all by running on a slower CPU. Speaking directly to the RTX 5070, we see around 17% more performance on the 9800X 3D than we do when paired with a Ryzen 3700X. Again, a noticeable difference in some games, especially those on the lower end of playability, but nothing adjusting a couple settings to high wouldn't fix for us. One of the neat things about this hobby is the number of combinations of hardware that you can put together and how those choices affect performance in different ways. It's not nearly as simple as putting GPUs and CPUs into tier groups and just picking off of those lists. Sometimes you have to test an RTX 5070 on a 6-year-old CPU just to see what will happen, and in this case, it's still 50% faster than the GPU you likely bought when that CPU was brand new. So, was your prediction about performance correct from the beginning of this video? Let me know down in the comments, or better yet, join my Discord server. I do have it paywalled as a perk of joining the Patreon, but it's more of a $1 tax to keep the trolls at bay. We love talking about weird hardware combinations, servers, home lab gear, and of course, what beverage you enjoy too. Link to the Patreon is down in the video description. And that's going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, everyone. Can I go to bed now? No. Damn. Beer for today is from Asbury Park Brewery. It is the Sea Dragon IPA. Hey, what can I say about our East Coast IPA? Perfect for good times or bad, loaded with a whole lot of Misty Mountain hops for a huge nose of citrus and pine. Singing to the ocean, can you hear the ocean's roar? 7%, 32 IBU. I didn't realize that was a sea shanty when I started reading it, so had to giggle halfway through. One thing I can tell you right away about this beer without knowing anything about it, and had I not even known it was a sea shanty inspired brew, this is a brewery on a beach. It has a particular smell, a little bit of salt water. You know that smell if you've been away from the beach for a while and you get within about 10 miles of it or so. You'll get that little just wisp of salt in the air. That's what this smells like. I like it. There are a few beers that take me places. And what I mean by that is trigger little neurons in your brain to transport you to a memory. And this one, like I said, takes me right to the Oregon coast. I mean, I know it's a New Jersey beer. It's got a very coastal feel to it. I think there's a couple things working for it. Number one, just that slight bit of salt right on the nose. And you get it in the flavor too. It's not, I don't think it's my brain playing tricks on me. There's a bit of salt to this beer, and I really like it. Number two is, while this is an IPA, it is very much an East Coast IPA, not a hazy IPA. That's something different, but an East Coast IPA. And it's almost Kolsch-like. It's almost a bit of like saltwater taffy and honey mixed with some citrusy hop. And there's a brewery on the Oregon coast, you might know it, Rogue Ales and Spirits, who makes Dead Guy Ale. They're based right on the Oregon coast, and they have one of my favorite Kolsch's. And so between just a little bit of that saltwater air and just the slightest tinge of honey, I feel like I'm on the beach. That's a thing I didn't expect to feel tonight. This beer has me feeling feelings, and I like it. But this is likely the only title you'll come across outside of Microsoft Flight Sim or Skitty Skylines. Skitty Skylines. Skitty Skylines. It's 10 p.m. This video has to launch at 6 a.m. in 8 hours. I have an excuse.